The scissors glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights of the school hallway. Students crowded around, their whispers sharp and cutting. A uniformed officer stood in the center of it all, his expression cold and unflinching. In front of him, a 15-year-old girl named Brielle sat frozen in her chair, tears streaming down her face as he grabbed a fistful of her thick, coiled hair. "Maybe now you'll learn some respect," the officer spat, his voice echoing against the lockers. "You think you're better than everyone else because of your little speech in class? Well, let's see how proud you are now." Brielle tried to move, her hands trembling as they gripped the armrests. "Please, this isn't right. You can't." The officer's hand pushed her back down. The sound of the scissors snapping shut rang out, and strands of her hair fell to the floor like feathers. The crowd gasped, but no one stepped forward. No one dared. "Look at her now," the officer sneered. "No more attitude. No more thinking you can talk back. Maybe you'll finally learn your place." The humiliation burned hotter than the tears running down Brielle's face. Her chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Students whispered behind their hands, others just stared, wide-eyed and horrified. Somewhere in the crowd, a teacher tried to step in. "Officer, this is unnecessary. She's just a kid," the teacher said. The officer spun around, his voice booming. "She broke the rules. This school has been far too lenient with this kind of behavior. I'm doing what needs to be done." The scissors snapped again, and another chunk of Brielle's hair fell. She wanted to scream, to run, to fight back, but her legs felt bolted to the chair. All she could do was sit there as the officer's cruelty unfolded. Second by second. Then, the front doors slammed open. The heavy sound of footsteps pounded through the hall, each one louder than the last. Students turned to look, their eyes widening as a man in a dark suit appeared, his badge catching the light. It was Brielle's father, Adrian Brooks, an FBI agent who had arrived just in time. The officer froze mid-cut, his eyes locking with Adrian's. "What are you doing here? This is a school matter." "No," Adrian interrupted, his voice sharp and commanding. "This is a federal matter now." The room fell silent. The tension was thick, suffocating. The officer took a step back, the scissors trembling slightly in his hand. "Step away from her," Adrian said, his voice low but lethal. "Now." The officer hesitated, but the authority radiating from Adrian was undeniable. He let the scissors drop to the floor with a metallic clatter. Brielle looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief and relief. But her shame lingered. Her hair, her identity, lay scattered in pieces at her feet. "You don't understand," the officer stammered, his confidence unraveling. "She was out of line. She was disrespectful. I had to." "You had to nothing," Adrian cut him off. "You abused your power, and now you're going to face the consequences." The crowd, once frozen, began to murmur. Phones were out, recording every second. The officer's face paled as he realized his authority was slipping through his fingers. Adrian stepped closer, his eyes locked on the man who had humiliated his daughter. "You picked the wrong person to mess with," he said, his voice trembling with controlled fury. "You think you're untouchable? You're about to find out how wrong you are." The officer's mouth opened to protest, but no words came out. He took a step back as Adrian pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Within moments, more agents appeared at the door, their presence heavy and unyielding. The students watched, their eyes wide with disbelief, as the officer who had just been cutting Brielle's hair was now being handcuffed. The whispers grew louder. Some looked away, unable to meet his eyes. Others stared, their faces filled with a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. But Brielle wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her father, her protector, the man who had shown up in her darkest moment. Her heart still pounded with fear, but there was something else now, something stronger, hope. And yet, as the officer was led away, his face red and his voice trembling with protests, there was a lingering question in the air: how far would Adrian go to make sure justice was served? And what would happen to the officer now that the tables had turned? No one could have predicted what came next. The whispers grew louder as the officer was handcuffed. Some students looked away, unable to meet his eyes, while others stared, their faces filled with a mix of disbelief and satisfaction. But 16-year-old Zoe Carter wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her father, Jordan Carter, a man who had become her protector in the darkest moment of her life. Her heart still pounded with fear, but now something stronger began to take hold, hope. And yet, as the officer was led away, his face red and his protests trembling, a lingering question hung in the air: how far would Jordan go to ensure justice was served? What would happen now that the tables had turned? No one could have predicted what was coming next. Blank. That morning had started like any other. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen window of their modest home, highlighting the organized chaos of a family breakfast. Zoe sat at the table, her elbows resting on the smooth wood as she flipped through her notes. Her pen tapped rhythmically against the lined paper, but her eyes weren't on her writing. She was rehearsing, mentally running through every line, every pause, every emphasis, for her speech that afternoon in front of the entire school. It was supposed to be her moment. Jordan stood by the stove, flipping pancakes while occasionally glancing at the news on his phone. As a decorated FBI agent, he had spent years navigating high-stakes investigations. But at home, he tried to leave his professional edge at the door. Especially for Zoe, she had inherited his fierce determination and sharp mind, and he always encouraged her to use them. "You're too quiet this morning," Jordan said, not looking up from his screen. "That's not like you." Zoe glanced up and tried to smile. "Just nervous, I guess. The whole school's going to be there. What if I mess up?" "You won't," he said, setting down the spatula and turning to face her. His expression softened. "You've practiced this 100 times. Besides, no one knows more about this topic than you. Own it." She nodded, absorbing his confidence as best she could. But her stomach remained in knots. Her speech wasn't just any presentation. It was about systemic injustice and identity, issues she cared deeply about but knew made people uncomfortable. The school had given her the platform, but not everyone was happy about it. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. A text from her best friend, Emma, lit up the screen. "Good luck today. Don't let him scare you." Zoe appreciated Emma's encouragement, but she knew not everyone felt the same way. She'd overheard the whispers in the hallways, seen the side eyes from certain teachers, and, most of all, felt the tension whenever Officer Derek Hayes was around. Officer Hayes had been assigned to the school as a resource officer a few months prior. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an air of authority that demanded attention. But it wasn't just his presence that unsettled people, it was his attitude. He seemed to single out students who didn't fit his mold, and Zoe had been in his crosshairs ever since she challenged his comments during a school forum. By the time the school assembly began, Zoe's nerves had reached a crescendo. She stepped up to the podium, her hands gripping its edges, and began her speech. The room was silent at first. Then murmurs started to ripple through the audience as she tackled issues that were often left unsaid. Zoe pushed forward, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. But as she wrapped up, Officer Hayes stood abruptly, his voice cutting through the room. "You think you can say whatever you want without consequences?" he bellowed. "This kind of talk is divisive, and it has no place here." Zoe froze as Hayes marched toward her, his boots heavy on the stage floor. The crowd gasped as he grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the hallway. "Let's see how proud you are now," he sneered, pulling out a pair of scissors. The fluorescent lights glared down as the crowd followed, too stunned to intervene. Hayes grabbed a fistful of her hair, snapping the scissors loudly. Strands of hair fell to the ground as Zoe sat paralyzed, tears streaming down her face. Then, the school doors slammed open. Heavy footsteps echoed as Jordan appeared, his FBI badge gleaming. "Step away from her," he commanded, his voice sharp and unyielding. Hayes hesitated, but the power in Jordan's stance was undeniable. The scissors clattered to the floor. Within moments, federal agents arrived, and Hayes was handcuffed, his protests drowned out by the buzz of phones recording every second. As the crowd dispersed, Zoe looked at her father. Though her heart still raced, she felt a newfound sense of safety and resolve. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a fight for justice that she knew her father wouldn't let go unanswered. Sophia Jackson, 17, had always been outspoken. Her teachers called her fearless. But Officer Derek Hayes, the school's resource officer, called it defiant. Ever since she challenged him during a discussion about law enforcement, the tension between them had grown. Officer Hayes didn't like questions, and Sophia had plenty of them. Today, however, her questions would spark something far worse. The school parking lot was already packed when Sophia and her father, Marcus Jackson, pulled in. Marcus, an FBI agent with an unwavering sense of justice, had taken the morning off to support his daughter's speech on systemic injustice. As students milled about with signs and quiet chatter, Marcus turned to Sophia. "Call me if anything happens," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "I'll be fine," she replied, forcing a smile she didn't quite feel. Her heart raced as she walked into the school, the weight of her speech pressing down on her chest. The auditorium was full. Students, teachers, and a few parents filled the rows, their expressions ranging from supportive to skeptical. Sophia spotted her best friend, Mia, near the front, giving her an encouraging thumbs up. Drawing in a shaky breath, she stepped up to the podium. "Good morning," she began, gripping the edges of the podium to steady herself. "Today, I want to talk about identity, how it shapes us, defines us, and how it's often challenged in ways we don't expect." Her voice, though steady, carried an undertone of nerves as she continued. Sophia laid out examples, statistics, and personal stories that painted a clear picture of injustice. Some students nodded, others crossed their arms. The room buzzed with murmurs. But Sophia pressed forward. By the time she finished, applause mixed with tension filled the room. Then, Officer Hayes stood, his voice cut through the noise like a blade. "You think you're oppressed? That you're some kind of victim? Let me tell you something. Young lady, you don't know the first thing about real struggles." Gasps rippled through the audience as Hayes stalked toward the stage, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "This kind of talk divides people," he snarled, "and you're not going to do that in my school." Sophia's pulse raced. "I have the right to speak." "Not anymore." Hayes grabbed her arm and marched her toward the back of the stage. Phones rose, recording every step, but no one intervened. Her voice cracked as she tried to protest. But Hayes wasn't listening. In the hallway, the confrontation escalated. "You think you can just say whatever you want without consequences?" he hissed. "You need to be put in your place. You can't do this," Sophia cried. "You're out of line." "No, you're out of line," Hayes snapped, yanking a pair of scissors from a nearby drawer. "And I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." The cold metal touched her scalp, and Sophia's world spun. Students gathered in the doorway, their faces pale. Some yelled for help, but no one stepped forward. Tears streamed down Sophia's face as Hayes snipped away at her hair, the strands falling like feathers to the floor. Then, the front doors slammed open. The silence that followed felt heavier than the air itself. Marcus Jackson stood at the entrance, his sharp, commanding presence filling the space. He didn't speak immediately, his gaze moving from Hayes to Sophia, taking in the scene, her tear-streaked face, the scattered hair, and the trembling officer. "Step away from her," Marcus said, his voice low but lethal. Hayes froze, his grip on the scissors loosening. His hand lingered near them, trembling slightly. "What are you doing here? This is a school matter." "No," Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "This is a federal matter now." Hayes hesitated, But the authority radiating from Marcus was undeniable. He dropped the scissors with a metallic clatter. Sophia's wide eyes locked onto her father, the fear on her face slowly giving way to relief. "You don't understand," Hayes stammered. She was out of line. "Disrespectful. I had to." "You had to nothing," Marcus barked. "You abused your power. And now you're going to face the consequences." Students whispered furiously as federal agents arrived moments later, their presence unyielding. Hayes was handcuffed, his protests drowned out by the sound of phones recording every second. Sophia's chest heaved as she looked at her father. He stepped forward, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said softly, though his tone carried the weight of determination. "But we're not done." As Hayes was led away, his face flushed with shame, the tension in the hallway began to ease. But for Sophia, one question lingered: how far would her father go to ensure justice? The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to face what came next. The hallway was silent, the weight of what had just unfolded hanging heavy in the air. Amelia Carter, 15, stood frozen, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her stomach churned. She wanted to run to her father, Jacob Carter, who had just arrived like a force of nature. She wanted him to fix this, to make it stop, but the way he stood there, rigid, controlled, yet simmering with anger, made her stay where she was. Officer Derek Hayes broke the silence first, his voice forced and defensive. "You can't just barge in here like this," he said. "This is a school matter, not a federal one." Jacob raised a hand, and Hayes' words died mid-sentence. "Let her go." Amelia felt Hayes' fingers twitch before he finally released her arm. She stumbled back, her legs unsteady, but she didn't fall. Jacob's piercing eyes never left Hayes. "I don't know what you think you're doing here," Hayes said, attempting to sound firm, but the waver in his voice betrayed him. "This girl has been out of control, causing disruptions, stirring up division, disrespecting authority. Someone had to humiliate her." Jacob's voice cut through Hayes' excuses like a blade. "Someone had to make an example out of her? By assaulting her? By cutting her hair?" Hayes straightened his back. "You don't understand what's been happening in this school, the tension she's causing. The only tension in this hallway," Jacob snapped, his words heavy and deliberate, "is the one you created. You put your hands on a child. You violated her rights, and you did it because you thought no one would stop you." Hayes' face turned red, his hand instinctively resting on the radio clipped to his shoulder. "I did what I had to do to maintain order." "You abused your power," Jacob interrupted, stepping closer, "and now, you're going to answer for it." By now, a crowd of students had gathered outside the hallway door, their phones held high, capturing every moment. Amelia could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their stares like a spotlight she couldn't escape. Her heart pounded, her breath shallow. She wanted to believe her father's presence was enough to make everything right. But the defiance in Hayes' eyes told her otherwise. Hayes stepped back, his jaw tightening. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. "You think you can walk in here and just take over? I've been enforcing the rules in this school since before you ever." "This isn't about rules," Jacob interrupted again, his voice colder, sharper. "This is about your ego, your prejudice, and your abuse of power." He gestured toward the students in the hallway. "You thought no one would stop you because you thought no one could. But you were wrong." Hayes' eyes flicked to the crowd, then back to Jacob. His breathing quickened. "You don't scare me," he muttered. "You should be scared," Jacob said, his voice low and steady. "Not of me, but of what comes next." Amelia's stomach twisted at those words. There was something in her father's tone she had never heard before. It wasn't just anger, it was finality. Hayes' radio crackled, breaking the tension for a brief moment. He reached for it out of habit. But Jacob stepped closer, his voice dropping low enough for only Hayes to hear. "If you think this ends here, you're wrong." Hayes' hand froze. Amelia saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. But then he clenched his jaw and straightened his shoulders. "You don't have jurisdiction here," he said through gritted teeth. "This isn't just a school matter anymore," Jacob replied, stepping back and pulling out his phone. His eyes stayed locked on Hayes as he dialed. "I'm requesting immediate backup. I need agents on site for detainment and investigation." Hayes' face paled. "You can't." "I can," Jacob interrupted, his voice cutting through Hayes' protest. "And I will." The tension thickened as students whispered and phones captured every word. Amelia's heart pounded as she watched Hayes' confidence crumble. But it wasn't enough, not yet. The sound of heavy footsteps filled the hallway as federal agents arrived. Their presence undeniable, they moved toward Hayes, who had no choice but to comply. As handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the whispers among the students grew louder. Some looked away, unable to meet his eyes. Others stared, their faces a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. But Amelia wasn't looking at him. Her tear-streaked face was fixed on her father, the man who had come when she needed him most. Her chest heaved as relief mingled with determination. This wasn't over. Justice had been set in motion. But it was only the beginning. For the first time, she wasn't afraid to face what came next. Ethan Reynolds, 14, watched as the man who had tried to humiliate him now stood trembling, his hands in cuffs. But Ethan didn't feel satisfied. He wanted Officer Derek Grant to feel the full weight of what he had done, the shame he had tried to force upon him. Grant's voice dropped, and he took a step closer to Ethan's father. "James Reynolds, you really think this is going to end well for you?" Grant hissed. "You think you can make this about race and walk away clean?" James didn't flinch. His voice was calm but sharp. "This isn't about race. This is about consequences." Grant's hand hovered near his belt. But James stood firm, his imposing presence unmoving. The air in the hallway felt thick, almost suffocating, as the two men stood inches apart. Neither backed down. Then, the distant wail of sirens broke through the tension. Grant's face fell. Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes darting between his father and the man who had just tried to destroy him. The energy in the room shifted as the weight of what was coming began to sink in. Grant took a step back, his hands trembling slightly as a group of federal agents entered the building. The agents moved with precision, their uniforms crisp and authoritative. James didn't move. He stood, silent and commanding, as the world around Grant started to collapse. Despite the sirens, the agents, and the phones recording every moment, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. Something bigger was coming, something that would shatter everything Grant thought he knew. It was like the sharp intake of breath before a scream. The hallway was heavy with tension, the walls seeming to vibrate with the charged energy. Every sound, the shuffling of feet, the whispers spreading through the growing crowd, the sharp clink of metal handcuffs, felt amplified. Grant stood frozen, his hands trembling as the cuffs snapped shut around his wrists. The two agents flanking him exuded authority, their expressions unreadable, but Grant wasn't focused on them. His eyes darted to James, who stood just a few feet away, shoulders squared, unyielding, and radiating the kind of power that made rooms go silent. James' stare didn't waver, his voice sliced through the charged atmosphere like a blade. "You thought no one would stop you, didn't you? You thought you could do whatever you wanted to whoever you wanted, without consequences." Grant opened his mouth to respond, but James raised a hand, silencing him before a single word could escape. "No more excuses, no more lies, no more hiding behind that badge." Grant's shoulders tensed, his jaw tightening as though he was trying to hold himself together. "I was doing my job," he said, but the confidence that once filled his voice was gone. He was out of control. Disrespectful. Someone had to step in. "Step in?" James snapped, taking a step closer. His towering frame made Grant instinctively lean back. "You didn't step in. You crossed the line. You humiliated a child in front of his peers. You tried to break him." Grant flinched, but his voice rose defensively. He needed to be put in his place. Someone had to stop him from spreading hate and division. James' eyes burned with intensity as he gestured toward the students gathered in the hallway, their phones capturing every word. Hate? Division? Look at them, he said, his voice steady but cutting. Look at him. He pointed to Ethan, who stood pale but steady, his eyes locked on Grant. Does he look like the one spreading hate? Or do you? Grant's eyes flickered with something close to panic. But he tried to keep his footing. The weight of James' words hung in the air, pressing down on everyone in the room. You didn't just abuse your power, James continued, his voice a low, simmering force. You betrayed everything that badge stands for. You thought you could get away with it because no one would stand up to you. But you were wrong. Grant's breathing quickened, and his eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The crowd of students, once frightened and unsure, now stood firm, their cameras pointed, their resolve growing. As the agents led Grant away, his protests grew faint against the buzz of whispers and murmurs in the hallway. Ethan's eyes didn't leave Grant until he disappeared. Then he turned to his father, his protector, the man who had come when he needed him most. It's over, James said, his voice soft but firm. But this is just the beginning. Ethan nodded, the weight of the moment still heavy. But for the first time, hope started to replace fear. The fight for justice wasn't over. But for now, they had taken the first step. You don't understand the pressure in this school, Officer Derek Grant stammered, his words tumbling out almost incoherently. The rules are falling apart. Kids like him think they can do whatever they want, say whatever they want. Kids like him? David Warren, 42, a regional investigator for civil rights compliance, interrupted, his voice slicing through the tension in the hallway. You mean kids who speak up? Kids who refuse to stay silent when people like you try to push them down? Grant's face flushed crimson, his lips tightening in frustration. Before he could speak, David pressed on. You didn't do this to enforce rules. You did this to send a message. But guess what? I'm sending one right back. The gathered students murmured louder as the agents moved closer, their hands steady but firm on Grant's arms. David leaned in, his voice dropping low enough that only Grant could hear. You thought no one could touch you, didn't you? That you were untouchable. But here's the thing, you crossed the wrong person. Grant's breath hitched, his eyes darting nervously to the agents now reaching for their radios. He made a feeble attempt to pull back. But David leaned closer, his tone calm but razor sharp. Don't fight it. It's over. No, Grant hissed, his voice trembling now. This isn't over. You can't just come in here and tear me down. I've given years to this job. I've earned this position. David's jaw tightened, his gaze unwavering. You didn't earn it. You abused it. Grant clenched his fists, but the agents allowed him no room to move. One of them began reading his rights. But Grant's focus remained locked on David. You're going to regret this. He spat, his voice low and sharp. You're making a mistake. David didn't blink. The only mistake I made, he replied, his voice steady, was not stopping you sooner. The students surged closer, their phones raised high to capture every word. The hallway buzzed with whispers, some in shock, others in disbelief. Noah, 15, the boy Grant had humiliated just minutes earlier, stood at the edge of it all, his shallow breaths echoing in his own ears. He watched as the man who had tried to strip away his dignity now stood in handcuffs. His authority shattered, but as much as the scene should have brought relief, it didn't feel like enough. Noah's chest tightened, anger swirling with exhaustion. Grant's voice broke through the hum of the hallway one last time. You think this ends with me? He sneered. You think this school doesn't back me? These parents, these teachers, they'll stand with me. They'll fight for me. Noah's heart twisted, but David didn't flinch. Let them, he said, his voice steady as a blade. Because after today, everyone will know exactly who you are. And so will they. Grant's breath quickened, but his words lacked conviction. David leaned in one last time, his voice a whisper, carrying the weight of finality. "You should be scared, not of me, but of what's coming next." Grant opened his mouth to respond, but the agents began leading him down the hallway. The sound of his boots scraping against the floor echoed as the crowd parted. Their eyes followed him like shadows, some whispering, others silent in stunned disbelief. Noah's gaze didn't waver until Grant disappeared through the double doors. Only then did he turn to David. His father, his protector. David's eyes softened as they met his son's. "You're okay now," he said, stepping closer and lowering his voice. "It's over." Noah shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, it's not." David's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Swallowing hard, Noah felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "He's not the only one," he said. "The teachers, the staff, everyone who let this happen, they're still here. And they're still letting it happen." David's expression darkened, but he nodded slowly, his resolve unshaken. "Then we'll deal with them too." For the first time, Noah felt the tension in his chest begin to ease, though only slightly, as the hallway emptied and the agents disappeared. His eyes lingered on the spot where Grant had stood. The fight wasn't over, not yet. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid to face it. The hallway stretched endlessly, the sound of footsteps and hushed murmurs bouncing off the walls. The tension hung like an oppressive fog, refusing to dissipate. Emma Carter, 16, stood near the edge of the crowd, her breath shallow and uneven. Her hands were clenched tightly at her sides as if loosening her grip would cause her to collapse. Beside her stood her father, Alex Carter, 43, a civil rights attorney whose presence was as steady as it was commanding. His calm demeanor didn't soothe, it braced for impact. Every word spoken moments ago still lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating, yet Emma felt no relief, no sense of closure. Her gaze remained fixed on the empty spot where Officer Martin had stood. His wrists bound in cuffs, his protests drowned out by the agents escorting him away. The image played on a loop in her mind, his face contorted in fear and desperation. His eyes darting around as if searching for a non-existent escape. But instead of satisfaction, Emma felt a knot in her chest that refused to loosen. Her heart thudded against her ribs, drowning out the murmurs of the crowd. Alex broke the silence, his voice low but firm, each word carefully measured. "It's over," he said, but the weight of his words felt hollow, like a temporary fix for something far from resolved. Emma shook her head almost reflexively. "No, it's not," she whispered, her voice trembling with barely contained frustration. Alex turned toward her, his sharp eyes scanning her face for answers. "What do you mean it's not?" he asked, his voice softening but still carrying the edge of a man accustomed to fighting battles. Emma swallowed hard, her words spilling out faster than she could control. "It wasn't just him," she said, her voice gaining momentum. "It never was. Everyone saw what he was doing. The teachers, the principal, they let it happen." Alex's jaw tightened, the muscles flexing as he listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to calm her. He let her speak. "They knew," Emma continued, her voice rising with every word. "They saw him harassing students in the hallways, targeting people, humiliating them, and they just looked the other way. Or worse, they defended him. They told us to respect him, to follow the rules, to stop causing problems. They let him do this." Alex placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, but Emma barely felt it. The words kept pouring out, her anger bubbling to the surface faster than she could contain it. "And when I spoke up," she said, her voice breaking, "they acted like I was the problem, like I was making things worse just because I wouldn't stay quiet. Now he's gone, but they're still here, they're still letting it happen, and no one's going to stop them." Alex's voice was calm but carried a quiet strength that cut through her panic. "We will stop them," he said, "not just him, all of them." Before Emma could respond, the hurried clack of footsteps broke through the tension. Principal Harris appeared, his face pale and beads of sweat forming along his temple. He straightened his tie nervously as he approached, his movements jittery like a man trying to outrun his own guilt. "Mr. Carter," Harris began, his voice thin and forced. "We need to talk about what just happened. The situation is complicated." Alex turned to face him, his expression sharp. "The situation," he said, his tone biting, "is already being handled, or did you not see Officer Martin being led out of here in cuffs?" Harris swallowed visibly, his gaze flickering nervously between Alex and Emma. "Yes, of course," he stammered, "but there are larger considerations here. The school's reputation, the parents." "The parents?" Alex interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "The parents should be demanding answers. Just like my daughter, they should be asking why you allowed someone like Martin to abuse his authority in the first place." Harris faltered, his mouth opening and closing without a response. Alex stepped closer, his presence towering over the principal. "Let me make this clear," he said, his voice cold and deliberate. "This isn't going away. You don't get to sweep it under the rug. My daughter, and every student in this school, deserves better." The crowd behind them murmured, the weight of the moment sinking in. Emma looked at her father, her chest still tight but her resolve steadier. As Harris fumbled for words, Alex turned to Emma. "We're not done," he said softly but firmly. "But we'll handle this, all of it." Emma nodded, her gaze drifting back to the empty spot where Officer Martin had stood. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, she felt like she wasn't fighting alone. "Procedures, protocols, we need to follow proper steps," Principal Watson stammered, his tone desperate and defensive. Alex Walker's voice cut through the excuse like a blade. "You're talking about protocols now? After you allowed that man to terrorize students in this school for months? After you let this happen to my daughter?" Watson raised his hands, palms out, as if to ward off the weight of Alex's accusations. "No one wanted this to happen. But we can't rush to conclusions. The school's reputation is at stake." "The school's reputation?" Leah Walker, 15, interrupted, her voice trembling but steely. She stepped forward, the rage and pain of the past hours bubbling to the surface. Watson flinched as Leah's voice rose. "That's what you're worried about? Do you know what it felt like to sit there while he cut my hair in front of everyone? While he humiliated me, made me feel like nothing?" Her words came faster now, sharp and unwavering. "Do you know what it's like to be treated like you don't belong? Like you're the problem, just because you exist?" The principal opened his mouth but no sound came out. Leah's voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "You knew what he was doing. You saw it, and you let it happen. You defended him, you let him use his badge as a weapon. And now all you care about is saving face?" Alex stepped in, his tone cold and final. "She's right. You knew, and now you're going to answer for it, you and everyone else who let this continue." Watson backed away, his face pale, his voice faltering. This isn't what it looks like. We didn't know it had gotten this bad." "You knew," Alex said again, his voice dropping lower but losing none of its edge. "And there's already an investigation, not just into Grant, but into this entire administration, every ignored report, every student who felt unsafe, every excuse you made to protect him." Watson's eyes widened in panic, his words barely coherent. "You can't." "I already did," Alex said firmly. Watson swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he took another step back. I need to call the school board," he stammered. Alex didn't stop him, his gaze unrelenting as Watson retreated around the corner. The silence that followed was deafening, the tension in the hallway refusing to dissipate. Leah's chest heaved, her heart pounding as the reality of what had just unfolded began to settle in. She looked at her father, her voice softer now but still trembling. "What happens now?" Alex turned to her, his expression steady but weighed down by everything they had witnessed. "We keep going," he said. "We make sure no one ever goes through this again." Leah nodded, But her thoughts raced ahead. There were more people like Officer Grant out there, people who abused their power and got away with it. She had seen it, lived it, and now, for the first time, she wasn't afraid to fight back. The hallway had emptied, but the echoes of what had happened remained. Leah stood at the edge of the room, her hands trembling despite the sense of weight lifting slightly after Grant was led away. Relief still felt distant. Her mind was tangled with the memory of those who had stood by in silence, her classmates, teachers, staff, watching but doing nothing. That silence stayed with her, more haunting than the event itself. Alex stayed close, his eyes scanning the room, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Leah could feel it. He wasn't done. Neither of them were. The fight was far from over. Principal Watson returned after several minutes. His steps hesitant, his shoulders slumped as though walking toward his own demise. He avoided meeting Leah's eyes, instead addressing Alex with a voice thin and brittle. "I've spoken with the school board," he began, though the quiver in his tone betrayed his unease. Alex crossed his arms, his gaze like steel. "And? They've asked me to step back while they conduct their own investigation," Watson said, his voice barely audible. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain composure. "There will be meetings to discuss what happened here. And changes will be made." "Not just changes," Alex said firmly. "Accountability. Every single person who turned a blind eye will answer for it." Watson nodded weakly, retreating once more. As he disappeared, Leah let out a shaky breath. "What if it's not enough?" she asked, her voice small. Alex placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then we keep fighting." For the first time that day, Leah allowed herself to breathe. The fight wasn't over, but she wasn't alone in it anymore. "Managing the optics is critical right now," Principal Carson stammered, his voice shaky as he spoke to Marcus Ellis. "The media's already outside. Parents are calling non-stop, demanding answers. We have to control the narrative carefully." Marcus, a seasoned federal investigator in his early 40s, shot him a glare sharp enough to silence the excuses. "The narrative?" he repeated, his voice laced with incredulity. "You think this is about managing optics? This is about accountability." Carson's shoulders sagged, but he pressed on, desperation creeping into his tone. "I'm not making excuses, Mr. Ellis, but there's going to be fallout. If we don't control this, you don't control anything anymore." Marcus interrupted, stepping closer. His voice dropped, low but commanding. "Not after today. Your first concern should have been the safety of these students, not your reputation. The fact that it wasn't is exactly why this investigation won't stop with Grant." Carson paled visibly, his posture shrinking under Marcus's relentless gaze. "An investigation? You can't seriously be. I already have agents reviewing records," Marcus said without hesitation. "Complaints filed, disciplinary actions ignored, reports swept under the rug. This isn't just about Grant. It's about a culture that let him operate unchecked, a culture you allowed to flourish. The more you try to deflect, the worse it's going to look for you." In the corner, 16-year-old Maya Ellis watched the exchange, her fists clenched tightly at her sides. As Carson's shoulders sagged further, she felt no pity, only a cold satisfaction that justice was beginning to crack through the system that had failed her and others like her. Her voice broke through the tense silence, clear and cutting. "What happens to the teachers who supported him? The ones who turned their backs or made excuses? Do they get to stay? Do they get to pretend like they didn't know what he was doing?" Marcus turned toward her, his expression softening slightly. "Maya." But she wasn't done. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "I don't want this to just disappear. I don't want them to walk away and pretend like it never happened. Because if they do, nothing's going to change." Carson looked as though he wanted to respond, but Marcus cut him off again, his voice firm. "It's not going to disappear," he assured her. "I'll make sure of that." Carson's eyes darted between Marcus and Maya, his uncertainty plain. I need time to figure out how to handle this. He muttered. You've already had time, Marcus snapped, his voice sharp. Too much time. And you wasted it. Maya stepped closer, her voice rising with frustration and fury. You didn't protect us. You protected him, and now you're worried about protecting yourself. But what about the students he hurt? What about the ones who didn't have anyone to stand up for them? Carson finally looked at her directly, his face crumpling as though the weight of her words physically pressed on him. But Maya wasn't finished. Do you even know what it feels like to sit there and have someone strip away your dignity? To feel powerless while everyone watches and does nothing? I'm not the only one he's done this to. And you let it happen. Marcus followed her words with his own. Cold and final. And now you're going to answer for it. Carson's shoulders slumped further. He hesitated before speaking, his voice hollow. What do you want me to do? You're going to cooperate with the investigation, Marcus said, his tone even but unyielding. You're going to turn over every file, every report, and every email, and you're going to prepare yourself for the fact that when this is over, you might not have a job anymore. Carson opened his mouth as if to argue but found no words. Instead, he turned and walked away. Defeated, for the first time, Maya saw fear in his eyes, the fear of a man who knew the walls were closing in. As Carson disappeared down the hallway, Marcus turned to Maya. Are you okay? He asked, his voice softer now. Maya shook her head, her eyes glistening. No, but I will be. Marcus nodded, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his own emotions. They weren't done, not by a long shot. The fight wasn't over. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled them both back to reality. Outside, the voices of reporters and the hum of protesters filled the air. Maya glanced at her father, determination settling in her chest. For the first time, she felt ready to face what was ahead, not just for herself but for everyone who needed her to stand tall. The hallway was eerily silent as Grace Bennett stood rooted to the spot, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest. Her best friend, Leah, appeared at her side, her face pale but determined. Without saying a word, Leah stepped forward and pulled Grace into a hug, holding her as if to shield her from the weight of everything that had just unfolded. Grace felt her shoulders slump, the tension melting into the embrace. Leah's presence reminded her she wasn't alone. They're not going to get away with this, Leah said softly, her voice steady with conviction. Grace nodded, her throat too tight to respond. Not this time. Her father, Charles Bennett, stood a few feet away, his phone pressed to his ear. His sharp, authoritative voice carried quietly as he made call after call. Grace knew what he was doing, ensuring that no one could sweep this under the rug. But even with her father setting things in motion, her thoughts churned endlessly. She thought about the students who had watched in silence, their faces blank or turned away. About those who had cheered Officer Daniels on as he humiliated others. This wasn't just about Daniels or Principal Carter or even the teachers who had allowed it to happen. It was about the silent complicity of everyone who let it continue. Her chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with determination. Grace knew she wasn't done fighting. The echoes of Principal Carter's retreating footsteps faded, leaving an almost oppressive stillness in the hallway. Grace's pulse still raced, and her hands felt clammy. She could see the tension in her father's stance, his squared shoulders and set jaw betraying the storm brewing inside him. Leah stayed close, her silent presence grounding Grace in ways words couldn't. But even with Leah there, Grace felt the weight pressing down on her. Her eyes drifted back to the spot where Officer Daniels had stood, his bravado crumbling when the cuffs snapped around his wrists. At first, she had felt satisfaction. Now, the moment felt hollow. Leah broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. You should sit down. I don't want to sit, Grace said sharply, the words harsher than she intended. I can't sit. Leah's expression softened. You're shaking. Grace glanced at her hands and realized Leah was right. Her fingers trembled uncontrollably, as if her body hadn't caught up to the moment. She clenched them into fists, trying to force the shaking to stop. "I'm fine," she muttered, though the words felt like a lie. Leah didn't push. Instead, she stayed close, her voice calm. "You don't have to be fine. Not right now." Grace turned away, her eyes burning with unshed tears. Her voice broke when she spoke. "I just keep thinking about how everyone watched. They saw what he was doing, and no one stopped him. Not one of them." Leah stepped closer, choosing her words carefully. "They were scared, Grace, just like you were." Grace's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "But I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. And the worst part? For a second, I thought he was right. I thought maybe I did deserve it." Leah's voice sharpened, pulling Grace's gaze. "Don't you dare say that. Don't you dare let him win." Grace's breath hitched, her shoulders shaking as she exhaled. Leah stepped in front of her, forcing Grace to meet her eyes. "You didn't deserve this," Leah said firmly, "and you didn't let it happen. He did, and so did everyone who made him think he could get away with it." Charles's voice cut through their conversation as he ended his call and approached them. His expression was grim but resolute. "They won't get away with it," he said, his tone even but heavy with meaning. "The investigation is underway. Daniels is going to face charges. And the school will have to answer for every report they ignored." Grace looked up at him, her voice unsteady. "What if it's not enough? What if nothing changes?" Charles's gaze softened as he rested a hand on her shoulder. "It will change, but it starts with people like you, who refuse to stay silent. You stood up. That's what matters." The hallway began to clear as students slowly filtered out, leaving Grace, Leah, and Charles in the empty space. Grace's chest still felt tight, but her father's words gave her something to hold on to, a sense of hope. Fragile but growing, Leah took Grace's hand and squeezed it. "You're stronger than you think," she said quietly, "and you're not doing this alone." For the first time since the ordeal began, Grace allowed herself to believe it. There was still fire in Jonah Pierce's eyes as he spoke. "It will change. It has to." 17-year-old Ellie Pierce wanted to believe her father's words. But doubt gnawed at her. Sharp and unrelenting, memories of Officer Grant's cold glare and condescending smirk haunted her. The way he looked at her, like she was less than human, as if it was his right to put her in her place, played over and over in her mind. And no one had stopped him. What if there were more like him? What if this was only the beginning? Jonah seemed to sense the turmoil in his daughter's mind because his tone softened. "I know you're scared. I know you're angry. You should be. But this doesn't end with him. It doesn't end today." Ellie swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she replied, "I just want to feel safe." For the first time, she saw a crack in her father's armor. His face fell, and there was a flicker of something raw in his usually unshakable demeanor. His voice carried a faint tremor as he said, "You will," but it didn't feel like a promise. It felt like a hope. Voices echoed down the hallway, pulling Ellie back to the present. Teachers began to gather in clusters, whispering among themselves. Their eyes darted toward Ellie, then quickly away, as if looking directly at her might implicate them. Jonah turned slightly, and the weight of his presence was enough to make him scatter like shadows. Leah, Ellie's best friend, leaned in closer. "They're scared of you." Ellie pressed her lips into a thin line. "Good." Jonah glanced over his shoulder, his voice low but firm. "This isn't over. Ellie, you know that, right?" She nodded, her voice steadier now. "I know." Footsteps echoed louder, and Ellie's attention snapped to the end of the hall, where a group of agents reappeared. Their expressions were grim. One of them approached Jonah, speaking in hushed tones, though Ellie could catch fragments of the conversation. "Reports are pouring in. Multiple complaints, documentation, possible negligence charges." Jonah's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Make sure nothing gets buried." The agent gave a curt nod before disappearing down the corridor. leaving Jonah standing there with his shoulders squared and tense. Ellie stepped closer. What happens now? Her father's eyes met hers. Now, we make sure every single person who let this happen answers for it. Her heart pounded. She wanted to believe it was that simple. But deep down, Ellie knew it wouldn't be. People like Grant, and those who protected him, wouldn't go down without a fight. But neither would she. Leah touched Ellie's arm. Whatever happens, you're not doing this alone. Ellie nodded, her voice growing firmer despite the weight in her chest. I know. Jonah's phone buzzed again, pulling him away, as he stepped aside to take the call. His voice sharp with authority. Ellie looked around the hallway. Teachers and students lingered, their gazes filled with curiosity and unease. Some looked at her with guilt in their eyes, others with relief that it wasn't him standing in her shoes. Her hands clenched at her sides. But this time it wasn't fear driving her. It was determination. You're not done, are you? Leah's voice was soft but steady. Ellie shook her head. Not even close. The hallway felt colder now, despite the growing hum of voices around her. Her eyes flicked toward the far end, where teachers stood in small groups. Their whispers were sharp, hurried. A few stole glances in her direction before quickly turning away, as though eye contact might pull them into the storm brewing around her. Jonah paced a few feet away, still on the phone, his words clipped and deliberate. Ellie could see the tension in his posture, the weight of every decision pressing down on him. Yet even his presence wasn't enough to quiet the knot twisting in her stomach. Maya stayed by her side, her steady presence like an anchor. But it couldn't stop the rush of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Anger, frustration, and something deeper, fear. Ellie took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She wasn't sure what scared her more, the people who had stood by and let Grant get away with his abuse, or the knowledge that there would always be more like him, people who believed their power gave them the right to humiliate, to harm, to silence. But as her father ended his call and turned back toward her, Ellie straightened, the knot in her chest loosened. Just a little. Whatever came next, she wasn't going to back down. Not this time. And she wouldn't be alone. Not fear of Ethan anymore, but fear of what came next. 17-year-old Clara Rivers clenched her fists so tightly her nails dug into her palms. What if this didn't fix anything? What if the people who stood by and let it happen found a way to slip through the cracks? She couldn't let that happen. James Rivers, her father, hung up his phone and turned toward her. His expression was unreadable, but his sharp eyes pinned her in place. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating, until finally, he stepped closer. I need you to be ready for what comes next, he said, his voice low but firm. Clara swallowed hard. I'm ready. James's gaze softened for just a moment before the hardness returned. This isn't over. The investigation's moving fast, but it's going to get messy. People are going to start pointing fingers, trying to protect themselves, even if it means blaming someone else. Clara's stomach twisted. What if they come after me? They won't, James said without hesitation. Not while I'm here. She wanted to believe him, but doubt lingered. And what about the others? The teachers who defended him? The ones who looked the other way? They're already being questioned, James said. If they had any part in what happened, they'll face consequences. Clara shook her head, frustration bubbling to the surface. That's not enough. Consequences don't fix what they did. It doesn't change the fact that they let this happen. James's voice dropped, heavy and steady. No, it doesn't, but it's a start. Before Clara could respond, another voice sliced through the tension. You think this fixes everything? Clara and James turned to see Mrs. Carter, one of Clara's teachers, standing a few feet away. Her arms were crossed tightly, but the strain on her face betrayed the nerve she was trying to hide. Clara's chest tightened. What's that supposed to mean? Mrs. Carter's voice hardened. You think tearing this school apart is going to make things better? You think dragging everyone through the mud fixes what happened to you? James stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Are you seriously blaming her for this?" Mrs. Carter flinched but stood her ground. "I'm saying this school isn't perfect. What happened today didn't start with Ethan, and it's not going to end with him either. Maybe instead of trying to burn everything down, you should be thinking about what comes after." Clara's voice cracked as she stepped forward. "What comes after? What comes after is kids feeling safe. What comes after is people like you not turning your backs when something's wrong." Mrs. Carter's voice wavered. "It's not that simple." "It is that simple," Clara snapped. "You saw what he was doing. You saw how he treated people. And you didn't do anything. And now you're worried about the school instead of the people he hurt." James's voice cut in before Mrs. Carter could respond. "You're done here," Mrs. Carter faltered, her face flushing red as James stepped closer. "You're part of the problem," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "And if you can't see that, you don't belong here." Mrs. Carter turned on her heel, her footsteps echoing down the hall as she disappeared around the corner. Clara's hands were still shaking, but now it wasn't from fear, it was rage. Her breath came faster, and her vision blurred with unshed tears. James turned back to her, his voice softer. "I know this doesn't feel like enough, but we're not finished." Clara's eyes burned, but she nodded. "I know, and I'm not finished either." Megan, Clara's best friend, stepped closer. Her voice was quiet but steady. "You don't have to do this alone." Clara's breath hitched. For the first time, her shoulders relaxed, just slightly. "I know," she said again, her voice stronger now, "but this isn't just about me anymore." The hallway had emptied, the echoes of the confrontation fading into the walls. But Clara felt the weight of it still pressing on her chest. She looked toward the end of the corridor, where teachers and staff had gathered in clusters. They avoided her gaze, their whispered conversations sharp and hurried, as if avoiding her might absolve them of guilt. Clara's jaw tightened. She wouldn't let him off the hook. She wasn't done fighting, not for herself, and not for the ones who still couldn't speak. James placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "We'll make this right, all of it." Clara looked at him, then at Megan, who gave her a reassuring nod. She took a deep breath and straightened her posture. They weren't finished, not even close. For the first time, 16-year-old Emma Wright felt certainty instead of fear. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, and Emma turned to see agents returning, their expressions serious and focused. Her father, Marcus Wright, stepped forward, speaking quietly with them while Emma and her best friend, Lily, stood back, their eyes locked on the scene unfolding before them. Lily's voice broke the silence. "Does it feel real yet?" Emma exhaled slowly. "No, but maybe it doesn't have to." "Not yet." The agents disappeared down the hall, and Marcus turned back toward her. "Come on," he said. "We're not done." Emma followed him, her steps heavier now but her head held high. She felt the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her. But it wasn't unbearable, it felt like fuel. Every whispered conversation, every hesitant glance from the teachers, and every uncertain look from the students reminded her why this couldn't end here. She didn't look back as they stepped out of the hallway and into the next battle. This wasn't the end of the fight, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. Blank, blank. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Every seat was filled, reporters, parents, students, and community members who had followed the case from the moment Officer Derek Grant had been led away in handcuffs. The weight of the room pressed against Emma's chest. But this time, it didn't feel suffocating, it felt empowering. She sat beside Marcus, who looked as composed as ever. But Emma noticed the tension in his shoulders, the flicker of emotion in his eyes. This moment wasn't just about her, it was about every student who had ever felt invisible. Every voice silenced by fear, and every moment Emma had doubted whether speaking up was worth it. Across the room, Grant sat with his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His face was pale, his expression vacant. The arrogance he had once exuded was gone, replaced by something hollow and broken. Emma didn't feel sorry for him, not after everything he had done. Not after the flood of stories that came out during the investigation. Student after student had come forward with accounts of being targeted, belittled, and humiliated. Their voices, silenced for years, were finally heard. The evidence had piled up quickly. And with it, the facade Derek Grant had carefully constructed crumbled piece by piece. The judge's voice cut through the low murmurs, calling for order before delivering the verdict. Guilty on multiple counts. The words rang out, final and undeniable, for the first time since that horrible day in the hallway. Emma let herself exhale. She didn't smile, not yet, but the crushing weight she had carried for so long finally began to lift. Grant's eyes flicked toward her as officers escorted him out of the courtroom. There was no fight left in him. No defiance, no anger, just the hollow recognition that he had lost everything. Emma didn't look away. She wanted him to see her standing there, unbroken. As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. His voice was low but steady. "It's done." Emma nodded, but deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The investigation into Grant had uncovered far more than anyone expected. It exposed teachers who had turned a blind eye, administrators who had buried complaints, and a toxic culture that had allowed discrimination to fester unchecked. Principal Garrett had resigned before the hearings even began, his reputation forever tied to the scandal. Several teachers faced disciplinary action, some were fired, others reassigned, but the damage they had caused wouldn't be undone overnight. Lily was waiting for Emma outside the courthouse. Her eyes shone with pride and something deeper, relief. She didn't speak at first, she just pulled Emma into a tight hug. For the first time in weeks, Emma let herself feel the enormity of it all, the fear, the anger, and the small, steady ember of hope. "You did it," Lily whispered. "You didn't just fight back, you changed things." Emma's throat tightened. "We're not done yet," she said, pulling back and meeting her best friend's gaze. "But we're getting there." Marcus joined them, his presence grounding Emma as always. "This isn't the end," he said, "but it's a start. People will think twice before letting something like this happen again." Emma glanced at the courthouse steps, where reporters swarmed parents and community leaders for statements. For the first time, she didn't feel like the world was too big or the fight too daunting. She turned to her father and her best friend, her voice steady. "We'll keep going." Marcus nodded. "We will." Lily grinned. "And we'll make sure they never forget what happened here." Emma smiled for the first time in weeks, the warmth of their shared determination giving her strength. The battle wasn't over, but she knew she wasn't alone. And this time, she was ready. "You did it, Zoe," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible amidst the noise around them. Zoe Martin pulled back from the embrace, shaking her head. "We did it." In the months that followed, Zoe's story spread far beyond the boundaries of their small town. It sparked protests, petitions, and a wave of policy reforms. Schools across the district implemented new training programs, stricter oversight, and stronger protections for students. Zoe found herself thrust into the spotlight. Interviews, speeches, and meetings with lawmakers became her new normal. At first, it felt overwhelming, like she was being swept up in a tide she couldn't control. But as time passed, it began to feel like she had found her purpose. Officer Derek Grant's sentencing was harsh, as it should have been. Assault, harassment, and abuse of power, all charges resulted in a lengthy prison term. When he finally got out, it was certain he would never wear a badge again. But Zoe didn't waste much time thinking about him. Her focus was on what came next, ensuring no one else would have to endure what she had. Principal Garrett, who had turned a blind eye to the abuse, faded into obscurity. His career was irreparably damaged. Rumors circulated that he had tried to secure a position in another district, but no one wanted his name associated with their school. Zoe didn't feel an ounce of pity for him. He had made his choices. And now he had to live with the consequences. Through it all, Lily remained by Zoe's side. She had been there during the darkest moments when Zoe felt like she was drowning. And she was still there now, helping her navigate the uncharted territory of her new role as an advocate. Their friendship became an unshakable anchor amidst the storm. And Marcus, Zoe's father, wasn't just her dad anymore. He was her ally, her advocate, and her fiercest supporter, a man who had always believed in justice. Marcus took the fight personally this time, throwing himself into every effort to create systemic change. Zoe knew she wouldn't have made it through without him standing beside her. Months later, Zoe stood at the podium of a packed auditorium, her heart pounding as she faced the crowd. The room was filled with students, parents, and teachers, their eyes fixed on her. Once, she had been too afraid to speak up, but not anymore. Taking a deep breath, she stepped up to the microphone. Her voice steady. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she began. "It doesn't happen because one person stands up and speaks out. It happens when we refuse to stay silent, when we refuse to look away, when we decide that enough is enough." The crowd was silent, hanging onto her every word. For the first time, Zoe felt like she truly belonged. She wasn't the scared girl sitting in a chair anymore. She had become something else, stronger, braver, louder. After the applause died down, Zoe scanned the faces in the audience. She wondered how many of them had once stayed silent, looked the other way, or convinced themselves it wasn't their place to step in. And she wondered how many of them would now think twice before making that same choice. "This story isn't just about me," she continued. "It's about all of us. About what happens when we let fear and complacency keep us from standing up for what's right. It's about the damage silence can cause, and the power of speaking out." Her voice grew stronger as she leaned into her message. How many times have we seen something wrong and told ourselves it wasn't our place to get involved? How many times have we let someone else's voice be drowned out because it was easier to stay quiet? But silence isn't neutral, it's a choice. And in the end, it's the people who speak up, the ones who refuse to be silent, who make the difference. The crowd erupted into applause as Zoe stepped back from the microphone, her message resonating deeply. She had turned her pain into power, her silence into a movement. As she walked off stage, Lily met her with a proud smile. "You're not just telling people to fight back, you're giving them the strength to." Zoe nodded, her voice steady but filled with determination. "This isn't over, it's just the beginning." And for the first time, Zoe truly believed it. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for everyone who had ever felt voiceless. And she wasn't going to stop until the world changed.